Thank you so much, everyone, for taking your lunchtime, really, to listen to me talk about something which is probably not the most, shall we say, positive or uplifting topic, which is thinking about the usefulness of utopian thinking in the Anthropocene, but more importantly, actually, during COVID-19, the global crisis. Now, in the New Statesman, David Miliband came to the conclusion that post-COVID crisis, in the post-COVID crisis, the alternative is not utopia. For him, the conclusion was what we have to learn after COVID is common sense and common humanity. And I want to challenge this a little bit, because the juxtaposition that's set up here is between utopia and common sense and common humanity. But actually, utopia and utopianism, in fact, is the essence of utopia. And common humanity is the essence of utopia. And also common sense is the essence of utopia. So in a way, that juxtaposition, which is quite an old one and a worn one as well, is not accurate and not useful either. I guess what I want to suggest is that there are new forms of utopian thinking and new forms of utopian methodologies in some ways that could catapult us with the help of utopian visions, perhaps into thinking about a different, maybe a better world. What's clear is that we will face global, indeed dystopian challenges ranging from the sixth extinction. What we also have now is a new wave of nationalism and very clearly anti-democratic policies under the smokescreen of the pandemic, and something similar happened after 9/11. What we also have is, and Black Lives Matter show that, is a continuation of racial and gender equalities. So we're in a mess. What I like to put to discussion today is if utopia and utopianism, well done, is a useful way of thinking about the changes that we need to make, maybe to survive, but at least to create some other kind of world. So just leave that child up there for the time being. I think that's quite a good, thanks so much. So what utopianism really tries out is to think about different kinds of worlds, better worlds, yes, but also worlds that perhaps use intellectual critique and political imagination in a very different way, right? So it's about telling stories, it's about narratives as well. And these narratives, as George Monbiot is saying, is that they should be created from the bottom up. Thanks, Emily, if you just leave that there. I think it is terrible, but it's not a mere chance that we find ourselves in a global pandemic amidst other crises, such as global climate destruction, that has led to a grand scale of human displacement. This is often forgotten in the debates around refugees. We have conflicts, we have wars as a result of climate destruction, we have a possible sixth extinction. And there's clearly, as you can see from this picture, a clear link between climate destruction and the recent outbreaks of diseases and epidemics, unless you want to go down the conspiracy route and think that this is biological weapon, COVID-19. So Vandana Shiva writes that zoonotic diseases are moving from non-human animals to the human animals as we destroy the habitat and home of wild species and violate the integrity of species by manipulating animals in factory farms, but also manipulating plants through genetic engineering with viral promoters and antibiotic resistance makers. And Sonia Shah wrote in the Monde Diplomatique, is when we cut down the forest that the bats live in, they don't just go away. They come and roost at the trees in our backyards and farms. Climate scientists such as Will Steffens, Emily, could I have the next slide? Thank you. Identify that 9 of the Earth's 15 tipping points have been activated and that we are on the trajectory of collapse. collapse of the ecosystem, and also collapse of civilization. So the fracture point is not necessarily only one, oil or water, but it's actually all of them. It's a systemic one. So it's oil, water, political, agricultural fracture points, but all together as a system. So at this point, you think, well, what's the point of going on? Can't we just drink champagne and wait for the end of the world, which is one way to deal with it. But in my talk today, I like to explore if and how utopias, and indeed utopian thought, is relevant or useful for these times. What would a COVID utopia look like? Emily, could I have the next slide, please? Because you could come to this conclusion, okay? This is Roy Scranton from his very short but insightful book, Learning to Die in the Anthropocene. What is the point of utopias? Shouldn't we upskill on our survival skills and self-sufficiency books? Now, in our period of the Anthropocene, and I don't have time to go through what this means, but it's a geological label for the period that we're in, we seem to have arrived at the terminus of time's arrow, when we speak with Stephen Gould, the end of human life as we know it. So what's the point then of utopian desire, utopian thought? Is it not just to come up with some kind of happy, harmonious, non-conflictual space that perhaps soothes and mollifies us, and in fact even distracts us from possible climate collapse and extinction? And I'm referring here to David Harvey. Or is utopian thought to be replaced by much more pragmatic approaches, whatever that means? See my quote from David Miliband. I don't agree with the idea that utopian thought in principle is there to soothe and mollify us. I also don't agree with David Miliband. But interestingly, in this article in New Statesman, David Miliband also argues for universal basic income, global education, and the alleviation of economic and social inequalities. If that is not utopian thought, I don't know what is. So one could have an argument with him about terminology. And in fact, Rutger Hauer recently talked about the universal basic income as a pragmatic utopia, would also say this is utopian thought. So even David Miliband would say that all these ideas around universal basic income, global education, and so on are in fact about common humanity. So these are visions for a better, possibly, certainly a different future. And they are not, and this is often where utopias are misunderstood, is they're not individualist dreams of what would I do if I won the lottery? And people often mistake this for utopianism. The problem lies somewhere else. So Rutger Bregman, who I just mentioned, he wrote a book called Utopias for Realists. And he said, but the real crisis of our time, of my generation, is not that we don't have that we don't have it good, or even that we might be worse off later. No, that the real crisis is that we can't come up with anything better. And that's really what I want to pursue, is we cannot fathom, we cannot think of a different kind of world. So what does that mean? Let's think that through. It means that we are suffering from a lack of imagination, political imagination, possibly, social imagination. Not only for ourselves, but also for the planet, human and non-human species alike. So utopias and utopian thinking is really about imagination. Asking questions, the right questions, will create also new narratives from the bottom up, to go back to John Monbiot. So utopias and utopian thought is one way of coming up with those narratives. Sometimes they're pragmatic ones, like universal basic income. Sometimes they're completely fantastic ones, improbable ones, but they get us thinking. And they challenge the status quo. They can also ask ontological questions about our relationship with, for instance, non-human animals and nature. They are, to quote the subtitle of a book by the essayist Rebecca Solnit, Untold Histories and Wild Possibilities. And I will put in the chat later on, because we don't have time to watch it, a very brief film by the Intentional Community Network, Longomai. They're originally Swiss and French, about the kind of questions they started asking during the lockdown. So I want to move on to talk what I think is utopianism. It's a bit of a Pandora's box, and as Luke knows, one could now spend hours trying to define it, and I don't want to do that. But let's suffice it. Yeah, if we leave that, brilliant. Thanks so much. If I just want to summarize that utopianism is really a multi-dimensional form of social dreaming. And utopias are very much described in considerable details and normally located in a very specific time and space that the author intended a reader to view as considerably better than a society in which the reader lived. This is Lyman Tower Sargent, how he defines utopia. So what's really important is it's not about perfection, is better than, okay? And people always go, oh, utopia is all about perfection. That's not the case. So it is about prefiguring a world creatively. And this is also a concept that anarchism has long adopted. It's a prefiguration. Yeah. But what's really important, as the science fiction novelist China Miéville says, is that we will never mistake those dreams for blueprints nor for mere absurdities. And that's really important. They're not blueprints to follow strictly, but they're also not mere absurdities. They're somewhere in between, which is about imaginative and critical thinking. What perhaps happened to us is, like Bregman said, is that we don't dream anymore. Utopians don't dream anymore. In some ways, in the Western world, utopias and utopian dreams have degenerated into advertising slogans. And there was a special issue of the Vogue in 2018 on survivalist fashion. Quite important. I hope you're all wearing it. You can see one example here. And the article of that Vogue special issue was that consider a cape-like coat, a pair of trekking snowboard pants, and a multi-purpose silver casual, I don't know what that is, as a starter kit. With such innovation, the apocalypse might well be averted. Buckle up, keep warm, seek big heart protection. Fashion might take the force of the blow. There we are. So you need to just wear the right clothes for the apocalypse. Could I have the next slide, Emily? Thanks so much. Given the increasing air pollution, instead of tackling it with appropriate environmental measure, air masks also became the symbol of fashion in China in the last years. Now, ironically, of course, they are lifesavers, right? Now, do I want to declare the end of utopia? And it has been declared in 1945, 1968, and again 1989. Do we have to ask the question again in 2020, is this the end of utopia? Can we imagine a post-capitalist, a post-peak oil, a post-industrialist, a post-nature, a post-COVID? If not, and this is what I'm quite interested in, a post-human global society that is better than the society we are living in. And I think Alex has quite a lot to say about this post-human society, I guess. You know. I think we know that the 20th century saw a dystopian turn in many ways because there were clearly more dystopias written than utopias. So it is very difficult to imagine a better future than the worse one. And again, to come back to China Miéville, he says it is actually easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, isn't it? In a world where the future seems to have collapsed into the present, how does utopian thought, if it all, manifest itself? And what I mean with the future seems to have collapsed into the present, if you particularly look at dystopian texts, the time lapse between the vision of the future and the here and now has completely been minimized. So the future is also the present. And you see that with Kinsamley Robinson. Could I have the next slide, Emily? Thank you so much. Now, when we think about change, we need to distinguish between evolution, between revolution and crisis and catastrophe. And all these changes are measured by speed. So evolution is slow, as we know. Revolution is quite rapid. And a catastrophe, a crisis, brings about sudden and profound changes. Now, a good example for catastrophe and change is the Icelandic volcano eruption 2010. Remember that? I cannot pronounce the volcano's name, so I won't try that now. It catapulted Iceland into an economic crisis, but it actually also resulted in refocusing the economy as self-sufficient. So energy and food now, for instance, are produced locally. They have all these greenhouses everywhere where they grow food on a hydro basis. So after crisis and catastrophe, adaptation could follow, couldn't it? And again, the COVID-19 crisis has shown how quickly humans adapt, perhaps too quickly and too uncritically at times. I'm often struck, and I leave that here for you to think about, maybe we can discuss this, how quickly we took on the measures of social distancing and we relied on the government's information. Motivated by the fear of illness and death, and that's quite real, but also, and hopefully, by respect for other lives, we lock down, we wear masks, we work from home to protect others. And if I look at the screens here, most of the people are at home. Perhaps the COVID-19 virus made us realize in an accelerated way that that we need to think about our life and how we want to live it. And as an aside, and it's a question that Greta Thunberg and other people have asked is, why do people not make the same sacrifices for the climate destruction? If we do this for other people and to protect ourselves and avoid death, why are we not able to avoid death when it comes to the climate crisis? So my suggestion is that utopias and utopian thinking really function in the same way. The virus provides the impetus for change. Utopian thinking provides, I would argue, the larger vision. Both force us to compare and contrast. How is it in the here and now, and how will it be in the future, and how do I want to live, and how do we want to live? So the important point here is the reaction to the enforced change. We could go back to how we were after the virus if we lack the imagination to dream of something else, something different, something more just. And then this is the danger. So I remember after the lockdown, there were really lots of queues for Primark, which for me is an indication that we would go back to where we were before. Okay. But we could also mitigate. We will hope, and there's a whole debate in utopian studies about this, and again, Alex is a specialist on this, that through technology, be it digital, bio, geoengineering, we could mitigate the worst effects of climate change by changing human bodies, but also our environment. So this is about techno and cyber utopianism and trans and post-human identity, I guess. But then also we could adapt, couldn't we? And the adaptation response, if you come from the angle of deep ecology, means that we need to rehabilitate our relationship with the earth, right? This also is based on the premise that we change our idea that we are exceptional as humans, because we are not. We also need to change the idea and contest the idea of the web of life, of capitalism, that sees the earth as mere raw materials. Yeah. And there's, in fact, it's quite interesting, there is a, I would call him a teacher, a thinker called Jem Bendel. He talks about the deep adaptation response. It's resilience, relinquishment, restoration, reconciliation. And in reconciliation at the end, he talks about the reconciliation between peoples, genders, classes, generations, countries, religions, and political persuasions. Otherwise, he says, without this inner deep adaptation to climate collapse, we risk tearing each other apart and dying hellishly. So Charlotte Buchan, who's a co-director of the brilliant Dark Mountain Project, seeks this deep restoration and reconciliation in old myths and stories as moral guides. And it's really interesting what she writes. So in a short piece on COVID, and I could put the link on the chat if anyone is interested, is she says, the real crisis we face is existential, who we are as human beings and what our presence means on this planet at this time. Ancestral myths address that crisis, not as a tragedy, but as material, as moral imperative to put a crooked thing straight. So for her, it's about shifting the paradigm, not something necessarily that we deliver in lecture halls or workshops, but actually something that happens concretely. And actually for me, that was also a call to rethink about what we teach to students, okay? Not just lecturing from the lectern in lecture theatres, but actually thinking about true change. How do we encode the change in our daily practice? Yeah. And as an aside, if you're interested in climate change fiction, particularly First Nation writers from America and Canada use their own ancient tales and myths in recent climate change fiction, so they become sort of the material to work from. So if we really need to shift the paradigm and radically by telling different kind of stories and debunking the old myths of happy consumerism, life-saving technology as mere ideology, how would we do that? George Monbiot said that you cannot take away someone's story without giving them a new one, okay? It's not enough to challenge an old narrative, however outdated and discredited it may be. Change happens only when you replace one story with another. So when we develop the right story and learn how to tell it, it will infect and I like the term, it will affect the minds of people across the political spectrum. But what is the right story? Or what are the right stories? Just my story might not be Gary's story or Luke's story. Mm-hmm. But the stories are not necessarily always about content, but they're about imagination and about inspiration. So the science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson, who's been very, I guess, verbal in recent years to defend the necessity of utopia, he says is that he wants to keep imagining that things could be better, and furthermore to imagine how they might get better. And another example of how things might get better is Rob Hopkins' From What Is to What If, and I'm holding up the book here. Some of you might know his work on transition towns. He's the founder of Transition Towns, and it's a lovely book. And he also reminds us that imagination is and can be an accelerator for change. So he asks, what if, in order to accelerate change? And then in the first chapter, he talks about how things turned out okay, and it's a kind of mini futuristic vision. And each chapter poses a what if question. What if we took play seriously? What if school nurtured our imagination? And we can insert universities here. What if our leaders prioritize the cultivation of imagination? So he addresses education, civic planning, politics, healthcare, and so on. And he does these wonderful exercises when he does Zoom talks about his book, that he asks all the participants to close their eyes and imagine a different post-COVID world. And actually, many picked up on the lack of traffic noise, the bird songs, cleaner air, community spirit during lockdown. But the flip side of the coin is, of course, possible unemployment, as we know, economic depression, a very real no-deal Brexit, not to forget that are looming above us and trapping in many ways, our imagination and making us afraid, quite rightly. I'm not underestimating or downplaying at all these economic hardships. But slogans such as build, 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 or shop, 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 and I don't know what the other slogans all are, only limit our imagination. So what we need to do is we need to unveil them as ideologies, as slogans. And so instead of the fear, we want to build societies with economic and social justice. So what if we continued some of the good things that happened during COVID? A number of pragmatic but far-reaching political measures have been already adopted across Europe. So why not continue stopping the clock for all people in need? Introduce universal basic income, support local and national food production and distribution, a debate that is certainly quite prominent at the moment in Britain. Look at new urban planning. Again, we have some urban planning measures here in Oxford with the bus gates. There's also a movement called Build Back Better UK that looks at urban planning. The EU, at least, is looking very seriously at implementing the new Green Deal, if with some limitations. So why not invest more in healthcare? Why not imagine even wilder changes? Maybe this is stubborn optimism. As a former United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change General Secretary Cristina Figueres named it. It is maybe stubborn optimism, but it is not irrational. Put out the next slide, please. Oh, the next one. Sorry, I forgot I had that one. Thank you. Thanks, Emily. We don't know the outcome of the news stories. We will have to die as individuals and most possibly as species. We might survive as transhumans, posthumans in a post-nature, post-apocalyptic and post-COVID world. We will develop resilience. Resilience, as a German scientist Andreas Weber suggests, resilience through aliveness and connectedness. We have proved, as Rebecca Solnit suggests, that we actually are better human beings than we think. Apart from the people maybe who fought over the toilet rolls during the first lockdown, and it's happening again, I can report back from the shops. So after Hurricane Katrina, Solnit suggests that the constellations of solidarity, altruism, and improvisation are within most of us and reappear at these times. People know what to do in a disaster. The loss of power, the disaster in the modern sense, is an affliction, but the reappearance of these old heavens is its opposite. This is the paradise entered through hell. Could we have the last slide, Emily, please? Oh, if there is a last slide. Maybe I've forgotten to put the last slide in. No? There isn't one. Okay. Okay, then it's my mistake. There we are. Thanks. The apocalypse opens up the possibility of utopia. If you think about her sentence, this is the paradise entered through hell. And we should, as Nicole says, you see, I'm a great fan of his, we should utopia as hard as we can. Thanks so much. And